Hi everybody, I'm Wayne Campers. I was very mindful of the fact that when Georgina approached me about a year ago, asked me if I would present at this conference, I was very reluctant to do so because as I say, I really don't like talking about myself. I'm inherently a very private person, and perhaps that's been part of my journey, is that I have been so private about myself that it's been difficult. Anyway, so I was trying to remember, it's 2009 that I first went to see Georgina. How do I move these forward, Georgie?
So on the right, please.
No. And what I've learned along my own journey is it really is more, this is a famous saying by Hippocrates, it's more important to know what sort of person has the disease than what sort of disease a person has. And that was very true in my case. I mean, over the years, I think, you know, and probably more recently, we're all aware of the types of stresses that we have in life. And generally speaking, I mean, I'm going to go through these slides quite quickly about, you know, what stress really is, okay? And it's about the adverse reaction that people have to excessive pressures placed on them and how that manifests. Now, for most of my life, I was living in this zone, in the comfort zone, and I had huge amounts of stress in my life. I grew up in apartheid South Africa. I went to the University of Cape Town Medical School, and I graduated, and then had to make some decisions about my life. It was around about the time when Nelson Mandela was released. I was conscripted to 2 years military service, which I really didn't want to do, but Mandela hadn't been released yet, and if I decided I didn't want to go to the military, I would have to apply to be a conscientious objector, which means I would have had to spend 5 years in prison. Unfortunately, in my last job that I actually worked in South Africa, I worked with a wonderful doctor whose uncle was Nelson Mandela's lawyer. And so I managed to get half an hour with him. And I asked him, what must I do? And so he said to me, go overseas and write to the Defence Force and tell them that you're furthering your career overseas. I was very reluctant to leave South Africa. My whole family lived there and still do. So I went to Canada, and I opened up my own GP practice there. I was in Canada for about 5 years. I wrote to the South African Defence Force. They said, that's fine, just let us know each year what's happening. And as we know, that was, Mandela subsequently released, and national conscription was stopped, and so I was free to return back to South Africa. My journey took me elsewhere, and I ended up actually coming to London, and that's where I qualified as a psychiatrist. So what I'm trying to say is that my life has always been a life that's been full of stress and big decisions and having to move and make huge decisions. But that never affected me. I've always been fit, I've always been healthy, I've always looked after myself. I've always been very exercise conscious. And then I'll actually come back to this a bit later. I'm just going to whip through this, okay? I'm going to tell you about myself, okay? So, for all intents and purposes, was fine. I had my career going. I was in my mid-40s, and this is how long ago I actually prepared this presentation. But this is only the second time I've ever given this presentation. So, at the time, I was in my mid-40s, active, healthy, okay? My son had been born, and we hadn't been on a holiday for quite a while, because for any of you who've got children, you know what a nightmare it is trying to travel with all the paraphernalia. And we used to go on international holidays, and we hadn't been to South Africa for a few years, and I thought it was time to go to South Africa because some of my family members hadn't met my son yet. And so we flew to South Africa, but it was at that stage where he was he was too young for us to be able to purchase a third seat. And he was 18 months old, and so I had him on my lap for an 18-month-old young rambunctious little boy on my lap for a 16-hour flight. So I got to South Africa, and we also then, during the holiday, I slept on a bed that was softer than what I was used to sleeping on. And when I got back to the UK, I just developed this lower backache, which I attributed to this long-haul flight abroad with my son in the soft mattress. And then over the next 6 months, my pain got worse and worse and worse. And I really didn't know what was going on. I tried everything, you name it. I went with all the conservative stuff first. I had extensive physiotherapy, I had acupuncture, I had Reiki. Discovered this thing called McTimoney Chiropractics. I had that done. I had Pilates done. And it just got worse and worse and worse. And then I started to develop neurological symptoms in my right lower leg. 3 specialist assessments later, one by an orthopedic surgeon, one by a neurosurgeon, one by a neurologist. And because I'm in the medical profession, I handpicked the top specialists to go to, top 3 specialists in the Northwest. And I went to each of them. 2 MRI scans later, muscular studies, nerve studies, and I was diagnosed with a prolapsed disc with chronic neuropathic pain. Subsequently had 2 failed caudal epidurals. I had a failed nerve root block. I had facet joint injections, and nothing helped. And then I started embarking on the medication route. My GP, I was quite influential over him. And pretty much I dictated to my GP what I wanted him to prescribe. And because he could see how much agony I was in, he never resisted. And so I just piled on more and more and more and more and more medication. I mean, at one stage, I reckon I must have been taking 40 tablets a day. It was unbelievable. And I knew that it wasn't good for me. And yet, because I'd been told by 3 eminent specialists that this is what I had, that I was convinced that somewhere along the line, even then I knew it made no pharmacological sense, that every single different receptor was being targeted in terms of all of these medications. I mean, mirtazapine is a well-known antidepressant that I prescribe a lot of, but I was using it in half strength because it's very sedative at half strength. And then I went to the big guns, even gabapentin and pregabalin. My pain got worse. And I became severely, severely disabled. I was still having to hold down a full-time job. With all of this medication that I was taking, 40 tablets, I was only getting 2 hours sleep per night. So I get to bed about midnight, and I'd be 2 o'clock on the dot. I'd wake up in the morning. And the only way I could get relief was I'd climb out of bed on all fours. I'd somehow manage to get myself upright. And the only thing that helped with this was walking. And so I used to wander around the streets with my headphones on, often for 4 or 5 hours. So I was existing on 2 hours sleep a night. Everything in my life that I enjoyed came to a halt. I could no longer do any of the exercise that I was doing. I no longer attend the gym. I could no longer play with my son. I had difficulty concentrating at work. I even changed my car. I thought it was my car seat. I had a two-seater car that had a sort of a buckety seat, and I thought it's got to be the car, so I got rid of the car. I then came down to London and got 2 further neurosurgical opinions by the 2 top guys in London. And both of them recommended that I have a lumbo microdiscectomy. So I wanted to know about what the prognosis would be and what my recovery would be, and both of them were very guarded. They said, look, we can't give you any guarantees about what's going to happen. So I was completely desperate, okay? So I decided, no, this is not going to happen. And that was, this was my presentation when I did it years ago, okay? So we're now talking, I mean, I'm now 51. And my life is entirely back to normal. I am completely pain-free. I'm very active. I'm very busy. I still have a huge amount of stress in my life. I still take on hugely stressful things. I still make big decisions in my life which are massively stressful. So the question is, how did I do this? Well, there's a couple of key people that really helped me in this. The first was my wife, who is completely non-medical, but a woman who she knew that there had to be something else. She just knew it, and so she started doing her research on Google, and she came across John Sarno's books, and she read them, and she came to me and said to me. She knows what I'm like, and she said to me, "I've got these books that I've got these books I'd like you to read. You might want to throw them out the window, but I just want you to read them." And so I said, "Okay, I'll read them." I mean, at that stage, I was completely desperate. So I read all of his books, and yeah, I mean, to me, they made a lot of sense, etc., etc., etc. But it didn't change my pain. It didn't change how many tablets I was taking. It didn't affect my quality of life. And I looked at all of this and thought, well, how is this going to help? And then, I think at that stage, Georgina was just starting out in the Northwest, been going for a couple of years, and somehow my wife stumbled across her name, okay, and said to me, "Would you consider going to see Georgina?" I looked at Georgina's profile and I thought, "Oh, I don't know about this." So anyway, I took the big leap, and I drove to go and see Georgina at her home, and I thought, oh no, she's working out of a back office. She's all very suspect. I really don't know about this. And then I met her, okay, and that was the single greatest thing that made the difference, because she was there not to prove anything. All she did was listen. All she did was listen to my story. And she said to me, "Look, would you consider the fact that you may have a stress illness?" And I said to her, "Look, I've read all John Sarno's books, etc., and but it wasn't until I'd actually sat down and be able to talk to somebody about the fact that I had a stress illness." So I started doing a lot of things that are, obviously Georgina's program has now come a long, long way since then. Back in those days, it was really about journaling, about attending groups with people, and I only ever managed to go to one group. It just wasn't for me. To me, when I went to those groups, it just reinforced my own sickness role, and I just couldn't do it. I was absolutely hopeless at journaling. And then I read a book. A book by a book called The Presence Process, by this guy called Michael Brown. Now, there was a whole list of books, and I read all of them, okay? But this book I read, and this guy happened to be a South African guy as well, just by chance, and he suffered from severe dental pain. And he went to the extent of actually having all of his teeth removed. He had every investigation done as well. But what he did was, and I mean, I don't want to focus on this book because it's not about the book really. It's about the fact that I found something that worked for me, and that was the controlled breathing. Now, I had tried meditation and it didn't work for me. But his controlled breathing, where you set aside 15 minutes each day at the beginning and at the end of each day, where you actually go through this process of controlled breathing, it's like meditation, and it allows you to actually empty your mind. And it wasn't until I did that, and I still carried on seeing Georgina, and I'd made the decision that I needed to wean myself off all of this medication, and so I did it very gradually, one at a time. Took myself off all of the medication, and that was tough because the pain was still there. And in fact, the pain often got worse. And I continued doing this controlled breathing. And it wasn't until the day that I actually realized that you have to take ownership of the fact that this is a stress condition. It's not until that day that you own it that actually the difference happens. Now, there are various ways that one can take that ownership, you know. I didn't do any therapy. I never went into my past. I never went into my life history. I've never had any major traumas in my life. I've never had anything massively happen in my life. The difference was when we go back to that very first slide, I was just operating in this zone, in my comfort zone, for so long. But I was continuing to pour stuff into my stress bank, my pressure cooker. And everybody's pressure cooker reaches a point where the lid's going to pop off. And when the lid pops off, it's going to come out in some form of symptoms. Now, I'm a psychiatrist, and I see people with multiple complaints on a daily basis, and my whole practice has changed because of the experience that I've been through. And what I really do get people to focus on is to actually look at their lives very closely and see what things in their life could be a cause for their stress and how they're managing it. And I have a range. I mean, I have a range of people that are people that are so obviously traumatized from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, to people who present with the whole range of medically unexplained symptoms. Okay, the typical fibromyalgia patients, chronic fatigue syndrome, and of course the new DSM-5's just been, well, it recently been published, and they've got this category called the complex somatic symptom disorder. When you look at that, and you look at all of the diagnoses under that, this is stress illness. Those are all stress illnesses, and I think that unfortunately it's still completely medicalized, and it wasn't really until the pioneering work of Georgina that changed my life. And certainly, I don't know where I'd be if that had not happened. We were obviously destined to meet. I was obviously destined to make that drive to her home in the Northwest. This I just wanted to bring up, and I'll leave it off. I'll leave my talk after this. Back when I did my initial presentation, I used this as a stress scale. There are lots of stress scales around, okay? I have a good example of pointing some things out to me, which at the time I didn't realize, okay? And that is that there are a lot of life events. There are a lot of life events that we don't think are actually stressful for us. We always associate a negative life event as being the source of stress. So, death of a spouse, divorce, all of these, major things, okay? But when you go down this list and you see things, there are often very positive things that happens in people's lives that actually are sources of stress as well. Getting married, falling pregnant, there's huge, getting promoted at work, getting a new home, just as examples. So the point I'm trying to make with this major holidays, which of course was in my case, that are actually can be sources of stress as well. So it does not have to be a negative experience in your life that is a major cause of stress. You need to look at other things in life as well. You may or may not be familiar with. There's obviously recently been a huge amount of apps that people now put on their phones. There's an app that I get people to put onto their phones, which is called Thought Diary Pro, and I think it's really great because it applies. It's very helpful in people with pain as well, because it allows them instant access to their emotions right there and then. So if they're experiencing a negative emotion, rather than trying to journal it later, they can actually go into Thought Diary Pro, put that feeling straight into the actual phone, and they can almost do their own cognitive behavioral therapy by saying, well, this is the thought, this is the emotion, this is the place that I was in, and this is how I got to change that thought and emotion. And then they often bring it to me, and I can look at the previous month just when they've put that Thought Diary Pro in, and patterns emerge of what their thinking was at the time. So I think it's a very useful app for people to actually have on their phone. And when we actually go to that list, I mean, I was scoring well over 300 on my stress list, 390. So it was inevitable that something was going to happen to me. I had a whole lot of things that had happened to me in my life, but they were all positive things. I mean, apart from the death of a very close friend who was in fact my gym partner. He died unfortunately at the age of 30 from right-sided colon cancer, which of course is a silent illness and usually only presents once it metastasizes. That was a huge loss there, but I processed that, and I'm very familiar with normal and abnormal grief reactions, and I thought that I processed that, the death of him, quite closely. But there were so many other things going on in my life. And I'm pleased to say, now that I own my stress, and now that I own responsibility for my stress, I still get the odd twinge, I still get the odd tweak, okay, but I know what it is. And it's because I know what it is that I'm able to then say, look at my life and say, okay, well, let me just look at my last week, or let me look at my day, let me look at what's going on in my life, and I'm able to say, you know what, maybe I need to tweak this a bit, and maybe I need to tweak that a bit. So, in a way, I'm a success story in this respect, and it was a tough journey for me to have to go on, but a very fruitful one, because it's taught me a lot about myself. It's taught me a lot about stress, and I'm now able to take that to my practice, and I think I'm able to help so many of my patients by not medicalizing their conditions. I tend to get, by the time that people get referred to me, often they'll be where I was, and it does take a lot of work with them. And I have some really good therapists that I use that are able to look at the stress in their lives, and I try and keep them as medication free as possible. Clearly, if they have a depressive illness, I'll treat it. But I really try and get them onto as little medication as possible and try and get them as active as possible. So that's me. Thanks very much for listening to me. And just as a last thing, because I've never had the opportunity to actually say this, I'd like to publicly actually thank Georgina, because without her, I wouldn't be standing here today.